Nice to see everybody. Does this sound okay? Maybe we should start, but just a few minutes of kind of contemplation to develop our motivation. So we're studying one of the core treatises of the Mahayana tradition. But just, the treatise is Mahayana, but then also as, each of us, it's also good if we cultivate it, become, Mahayana as like by generating at least like we call like effortful, or sometimes they call it artificial bodhicitta, right? Like, meaning it's not spontaneous yet. So to develop, so bodhisattvas have spontaneous bodhicitta, but we have to cultivate bodhicitta, and that's how you become actually somebody who has spontaneous bodhicitta. So just in brief, right, we can start by recognizing, right, like actually, like, from the moment I wake up, right, I want to be comfortable. I don't, like I don't want to be miserable. I don't want to be in pain. I don't want to be suffering. I don't want to be um, unhappy. And everyone else on this call exactly the same. All my neighbors are exactly the same in that way. Right? Everybody in my town, my region, actually everyone, all human beings and animals, other non-humans, right? We're the same in that way. We don't want to be harmed. However, everybody may be slightly different how we view harmed, but we don't want to be harmed. So we're all in that way equal. And just if we look at that, right, then it's easy for it to become clear to us, actually, if you think about it, that everyone's well-being there's nothing intrinsically different about one person versus another, nothing that makes a person intrinsically more or less valuable or being more or less valuable. So actually, my own well-being and the well-being of others are equal value, but others are infinite in number. So just with that first contemplation, right, becomes it becomes clear that it's reasonable to cherish others as I cherish myself, to care for others as I care for myself, to love others as I love myself. May I do so from my heart and in my action. But then not only that, right? Next, we're just doing a brief bodhicitta. So the next is like recognizing that actually my old habit is to focus sometimes exclusively or sometimes mostly on myself to the exclusion of the well-being of others. And actually, I've tried that, and it doesn't work. If I look around, right, at myself, but also at others, at my experience in the world, it becomes clear as a self-centered attitude. If we look at all the wars currently happening on the planet, they come from that kind of approach. Somebody being self-centered. If we look at conflicts, whether they're global or whether they're in families, between people, so many problems come from that kind of self-centered approach. Actually, if you contemplate it, right, that self-centered approach, the amount of misery that that leads to actually is overwhelming, actually. From violence and abuse to just like terrible relationships, whether it be with, at people's jobs or in their homes. Like the massive suffering that comes from focusing only or almost only on oneself to the exclusion of the well-being of others. It doesn't lead oneself to well-being, and it doesn't lead others to well-being. And I can't stop others from, I can't force others not to do that, but I can certainly change myself by abandoning or letting go of or shifting away from that self-centered attitude to an attitude of loving kindness, an attitude that cherishes the well-being of others, also myself. But since others are numberless, right, mainly focusing my energy on love that cherishes others, those around me. And actually, if we check, that kind of attitude leads actually not, to others' well-being, but mostly to my own well-being, actually. It leads to peaceful mind, kind of courageous mind, to good relationships with others. It leads to happiness in this life and good karma in future lives. And it's actually the main path, right, to enlightenment itself. And so all the well-being from just getting along okay with, your neighbor, all the way up to Buddhahood itself comes from loving kindness, actually. My own future Buddhahood even comes from loving kindness, compassion. So I dedicate myself to cherishing all beings, the love for all beings, which includes myself and limitless, numberless others. So then the reason for meditating, the reason for studying, the reason for eating breakfast, for walking around, for getting dressed, make that like we're integrating that, right? Love and compassion. And the ultimate expression of compassion, according to the Buddhas, right, is the wish to become enlightened, to most effectively be of benefit to all people. So I dedicate myself to love, to compassion, and to that wish uh, to strive for enlightenment in order to be most effective at benefiting all sentient beings, accomplishing the welfare of myself and all others. So with that kind of effortful bodhicitta, I'll just do once the verse of refuge in bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of generosity and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Great. And then, let's see. So today we said we would look a little bit at the tenets of the Yogacara Svatantrika Majjhimaka school, which is the school that which is the philosophical position. By the reason we're looking at that, right, is that it's the philosophical position that Maitreya took when composing the Abhisamayal, the Abhisamayal Alamkara, the Ornament for Clear Realizations. And it's also the philosophical position of the most important commentators that they took when commenting on it, like particularly Haribhadra, but also like Shantarakshita and Kamalashila. And I said this when we were studying the Tathagata Garbha, the Uttara Tantra. When Maitreya composed the Uttara Tantra, he took the position of the Prasangika Madhyamaka, according to Kalugpa scholars. But when composing the Abhisamayal Alamkara, he took the position of the Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamaka. So this text is written from that perspective. So we're looking at that philosophical school for a minute. Actually, maybe I'll just go on a short aside. Last night, I'd sort of been looking at the materials to prepare for today. And then last night I was sort of laughing to myself because I thought, like, it's nice, this group of people. And I was thinking, like, I was laughing. I was thinking, on this planet, and then particularly in this country, I was thinking, like, how many people are there who are interested in the philosophical positions of the Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamaka school of philosophy? And then I was sort of laughing because I was like, actually, it's if you said you were like, if there are a lot of people who are interested in various topics, right? But that's not one that would be like it wouldn't be like high on the whatever on the list of like the most common. But then it actually made me remember Lama Zopa Rinpoche, one of my teachers, who used when he would teach on the precious human rebirth. He would go through he had this way, almost like it was before Google Earth existed, but he would do it almost like Google Earth, where he would like focus in and then focus out and then focus back in. And so he would talk about like, precious human. There's one thing of having a human rebirth, right? And then he said, but that's not the same. He would teaching say that's not the same as having a precious human rebirth, right? And some of the qualities of a precious human rebirth include like faith in the Dharma, right? Interest in the Dharma, faith in the Dharma, trust in the Dharma, stuff like that. And so he would say, like, especially in the Mahayana, right? Like, it's so rare, actually. So having a precious human rebirth, because that's one of the teachings, the precious human rebirth is very rare. And it's just saying, it's not like judging other people. It's just saying there are certain qualities that they're talking about in Buddhism, the precious from a Buddhist perspective. When they say precious human rebirth, it means from the perspective of a Buddha. When they look, they go, oh, that's precious, because somebody can become enlightened if they have that. It's not saying others aren't precious in the sense of worthy of love or worthy of respect or but precious in the sense of like it gives you something. It can get you something. Right? So a precious human rebirth is what can get you to enlightenment. And so from a Buddhist perspective, it's precious. And part of why it's precious is that you have some kind of faith, right, in the path that leads to enlightenment. That's the Buddhist view, right? So I was thinking, oh wow, so like that there are some people who want to actually look at the tenets of this, philosophical school is like a sign of precious human rebirth, actually. So it's a good sign. Okay. So we'll kind of look at that school. And I want to say something else too. I will get to something about. I actually, this is the Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamaka school. First of all, I want to point out, like, even though, like, it's Madhyamaka, so Madhyamaka is considered the most advanced of all the Buddhist tenet systems, and then there are sub schools within the Madhyamaka, and the consequentialist sub school is said to be the final intent of the Buddha, right? The final view of the Buddha. So I sometimes point this out. So like, so then you might say, like, I sometimes think if you're sometimes I notice that because I'm American, like there's sometimes like an arrogance on my part, at least, where I would thought, well, I just want to study the most advanced one. Like when I was first studying, I was like, why would I study the less advanced? I'm somebody, and then I would realize, like, the monks in the monastery, right? Like someone like my gurus, my teachers, would spend like 7 years or 10 years studying texts of the Yogacara, Svatantrika, Madhyamaka. They would spend years studying schools lower than that and practicing. And so there's an arrogance to the idea of start with the highest, like it's a mistake. And as we'll get into it, I think this particular school, this is my own, I want to share my own perspective just on this one point, which is that this Yogacara, Svatantrika, Madhyamaka school is incredibly profound, wonderful school of philosophy. And in particular, we're going to get into it today a little bit and hopefully contemplate it together. But Lama Tsongkhapa points out, if you want to understand emptiness, you have to understand the object of negation, right? What's negated what are things empty of, right? And so Kappa says, if you don't understand the object of negation correctly, you can't understand emptiness. And so this school in particular, we'll look at this, is beautiful in presenting all the different, from the gross to the subtle objects of negation. It starts with very gross levels of object negation, and then you can, if you study this school, you can actually check in your own experience, like, can I see can I find in myself how I grasp at that object, right? And how it's not existent. It's grasping at something that doesn't exist, right? And so, and if you can, Chandrakirti and Nagarjuna point this out. They say, if you can't refute gross object negation, of course, you're not going to be able to identify the subtle one. You won't even know, you won't be able to tell what it is, actually. So this school is very profound and very precious in being able to understand experientially the different objects of negation for gross and on a grosser and then subtler level for meditation. So anyway, so we're going to look at that a little bit, but it's very precious in that way. But then going back, so first of all, why is it called Yogacara? So, and Yogacara, the word yoga and Yogacara is yoga, like, in Sanskrit, people know that word, right? And Yogacara, according to Gelugpa scholars, is a synonym for Chittamatra, which is a mind-only school. So yogic, sometimes they call Yogacara will be like yogic practitioners or mind-only school philosophers, they're the same. So the mind-only school philosophy, or practice, the yoga of meditation on this kind of practice. And so the Yogacara is a reference to that school of philosophy, which is actually another Mahayana philosophical school of philosophy, but is not Madhyamaka. So is like less subtle, less subtle than this school's. But this school of philosophy, when discussing conventionalities, how things exist conventionally, they mostly follow the Chittamatra school, the mind-only school. But they're Madhyamaka because they refute true existence. So they're not Chittamatra, and when they look at the ultimate nature of things, they're Madhyamakas. But when they're trying to describe how things function on a day-to-day level and how things function conventionally, they follow the mind-only school mostly. That's the way they put it. They mostly follow the mind-only school, but only on the level of conventional reality, if that makes sense. Or mostly on the level, actually. There's one sense in which they also follow it. We'll get to that in a minute, but anyway, so that's one point, is that when discussing how things exist conventionally, they mostly follow the mind-only school. Then Svatantrika, right? I'll get to that in a second. And then Madhyamaka. So Madhyamaka is easy. Madhyamaka means middle way, right? And it's the school of philosophy that follows Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna is said to be like what's it called? The gate opener or the path opener of the Madhyamaka school. And so they're Madhyamakas, so they follow Nagarjuna's view, which is that things lack true existence, which we'll get into what that means in a minute. But then Svatantrika. So that is Svatantra is usually translated as like autonomy or own power. So in English, they sometimes call that, the Svatantrikas, they call it the autonomy school, which is different than and Prasangika, which is the other branch of Madhyamaka, something called consequentialist, right? Consequentialist school. And I probably shouldn't get too into this, but I'll just say briefly. What that's getting at is that historically, as these schools were developing, there were debates between them, right? Nagarjuna wrote his treatises on the middle way, his treatise on the middle way, and his other treatises. And then there were scholars who were saying, well, what did Nagarjuna mean, actually? Because Nagarjuna's texts, if you read them, they're not the easiest to understand if you don't have a lot of innate wisdom. Even the Dalai Lama says you have to study. Even His Holiness Dalai Lama himself says you have to study Chandrakirti to understand Nagarjuna well. And so what happened was there were debates in India, in ancient India, between different Buddhist masters, great Buddhist masters. And oh, sure, how detailed to get. But anyway, Buddhapalita was one, and then Bhaviveka, and then Chandrakirti, and then Kamalashila, and so on. But the brief point here is that Chandrakirti's school is the most subtle, and that's the Prasangika, or the consequentialist. And consequentialist meant that Chandrakirti used various kinds of reasoning to prove emptiness, but his view that he emphasized was that it was enough. It was sufficient to show the absurd consequences of an opponent's position. So he would take he would do all kinds of reasoning, but he oftentimes would simply take the other person's position about how things existed and show, well, if that were true, then there would be this absurd consequence, so that can't be true. And he said, just through seeing the absurd consequence, a person can gain insight into emptiness. In contrast with that, Svatantrika Madhyamikas say, no, wait a second. You need to use syllogisms where there's you could say like a common understanding of the basis. So where there are two opponents in a discussion, it actually kind of makes sense. Both make sense. I mean, on the one hand, you can see Chandrakirti's view, right? If somebody's grasping at a certain thing, and then you show them the absurd consequence of that thing, they realize they're wrong, and they gain a realization that they're wrong. So that makes some sense. But Bhava Viveka and the other Svatantrika Madhyamikas, their position was, wait a second, if two people are going to have a discussion, they first have to agree on the terms of the discussion, right? They have to see a common locus, they call it, something that exists autonomously as it is. Like, so if you're going to debate about the nature of cold and hot, both people have to go, oh, that's fire, and fire is hot. If they can't agree to that, how can they have a discussion? Actually, we see sometimes the fault these days in our society of the faults, where if people can't agree on the fundamental basis of discussion, then they can't have a meaningful discussion. So you can see the reasons why, both positions make some sense, don't they? They're both good philosophers. So Svatantrikas say that you have to understand the basis and the reason, both parties have to agree on the basics of the discussion. And Chandrakirti actually didn't really disagree with that, but the difference, which we'll get into more subtly in a few minutes, is that Svatantrikas say that the parties have to agree. It's not just that they use syllogisms, because Chandrakirti also used syllogisms. It's that they say there has to be that things exist autonomously or under their own power as both parties see them, right? Like, so that both parties have to, their view would be, for example, if you were debating is fire hot, right? Both parties would have to understand that fire is hot from its own side. That's one way to say it, right? I'm not just making that up. I'm not just saying it's hot. It's not just an idea that it's hot. It's actually hot from its own side. And both parties experience it as hot. We can get into later why, but Chandrakirti would say, he would say there are absurd consequences to asserting that fire is hot from its own side. So that's not untenable position. But Svatantrikas would say, no, that's of course how can things exist conventionally? That's true. Conventionally, it's hot. So that's a difference. Anyway, I don't want to get too. We can get more into that, but it's not probably useful. All I was really doing was going through. So that's the terms: yoga, yogacara, Svatantrika, Madhyamaka. That's the meaning of that term, right? It's the Madhyamaka school of philosophy that, when explaining conventionalities, is mostly following the Yogacara or mind-only school, and that believes and that uses, they call usually in technical translations they call it autonomous syllogisms. Right? But I just explain what that means. It means that that's like a philosophical term for what I was just getting. So that's who these philosophers are. Then another point worth noting is, like, this school of philosophy, like all the Mahayana school, like all Mahayana philosophical positions, says they're and this is gonna be important later, so I'll say there are three vehicles, but so they all agree on that, but different philosophical schools disagree on this next part, but that there's one final vehicle. So what does that mean? What that means is that all Mahayana schools agree that there is the vehicle of the hearers, or in Sanskrit, Shravakas, right? Who are the people who are become arhats. They're aiming for their own liberation, and they're called Shravakas or hearers because they listen to the teachings, right? And then also they help others. They in the teaching and in the commentaries it says a hearer like Shariputra and Mahamalgayana, disciples of the Buddha, right, are examples of hearers. They're these Shravakas. And they're called hearers both because they listen to the teachings of the Buddha, right, and then practice them, and then also they help others hear. So they would go around and say, that's why often it says, "Thus I have heard," right, in the sutras. That means Shravaka says, "I heard the Buddha, and here's what he said." And then they help others hear the teachings and practice them, right? So they're called hearers for that reason, that they both listen to the Buddha teach, they practice what the Buddha taught, and then they help others to hear it by saying, "Thus I have heard. I heard what the Buddha said. Here's what I heard the Buddha say." And then others hear that and they can become a hearer as well, right? And practice it and so on. And the goal of their path is to individual liberation from samsara. Then the second of the three vehicles is the vehicle of the Prachika Buddhas, or like Prachika means solitary, so solitary awakeners, we call them solitary realizers. Solitary Buddha means awakened, right? So a solitary awakener, a solitary realizer. And a Prajeka Buddha is also aims for individual liberation, but they're not a hearer in the sense that they're a being actually who when they in a previous life they heard the Buddha's teachings, but they're not people who love what's the word? They like being alone. They're solitary, right? They have an inclination, a karmic, deep. It's beyond one life. Actually, they're kind of somebody who likes to. What's the word? They're individualists. I don't know. They're people who like to do it on their own. So they think when they hear the Buddha's teachings, they actually think in that life, may I practice this teaching, but may I achieve the result somewhere where there's no Buddha and there's no there's not Shravakas at a time when the Buddhas aren't on the planet. May I sort of go off on my own and practice and gain realization. And so in their final lifetime, when they achieve enlightenment, one point is there's no Buddha present in that world, in that planet. And they gain realization alone, and they don't teach verbally. So they're not like a Shravaka who listens in that life and then it says, "Thus I have heard." They actually don't teach verbally. They just set an example through their behavior. They're nonverbal. They do benefit others by their presence because they have a kind of great peace and great demeanor, but they don't give verbal teachings. So they're a different kind of person who gains individual liberation. And then the third vehicle is the Mahayana, right? The great vehicle, which is the vehicle of the bodhisattvas, right? That leads where the person's aim is not just their own liberation, it's to achieve Buddhahood for the welfare of all beings. So those are the three vehicles. And then some philosophical tenet systems think that those are what they call final vehicles, like that somebody who achieves arhatship, and that's the end of their path. But this school, the Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamaka school, actually is the same as the consequentialist Madhyamaka school in this way. They assert that there's one final vehicle. In other words, that everyone eventually becomes a Buddha. Does that make sense? So this school says, even that even if you practice the for example, the vehicle of the Shravakas or the vehicle of the Prajeka Buddhas, that eventually the Buddhas you'll achieve a kind of peace, liberation, but eventually the Buddhas will come and sort of say, "Okay, now it's time. Others need you. Now is the time to generate greater compassion and to work for the welfare of others," and they'll do that. So the idea is that everyone eventually will become a fully enlightened Buddha, according to this school's views. Those are just some basic tenets. Now I want to get into what I was starting with earlier. A few important points. for practice, that I think are useful for our own practice. And so the important point here is like what they say is like, what's emptiness according to this school? But excuse me. And this school has interesting positions, which I think can help us in our understanding of this text and also in our own practice. So this school says that the reason why I went through the three vehicles, is that we're going to get into it now, is that this school says that each of those different kinds of vehicles, right, each of those three vehicles, the practitioners of them have different main objects of abandonment. That's the technical term. Means a different kind of, there are different kinds of, or different levels or different kinds of things to be abandoned, right, connected to ignorance in our practice, and that practitioners of those different vehicles mainly focus on certain different things to abandon. This is, and I'll get through what those are, and I'll explain more in detail. But this is really important for us, even if you're not practicing, even if you're not mainly a practitioner of the Yogacaras for Tantrika, this is going to get into those different subtle objects of negation, or subtler and subtler objects of negation. So according to this school, right, the Shravakas, the hearers, it says their main object of abandonment is, you could say, self-grasping, you might say, if you want to say it generally. But then there's a gross and a subtle level of self-grasping that they abandon. And so if you're a practitioner of, and by the way, bodhisattvas have to abandon all of these, but we'll get into later what do bodhisattvas mainly focus on. But bodhisattvas have to be able to meditate on all these points. So that means if you're going to practice Mahayana, you have to know how to meditate on all these points. So if you're a practitioner of the here vehicle, there's a, and by the way, John, you had asked about this in an email once recently, is, in the 16 aspects, so they sometimes say the main practice of the hearers is to meditate on the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths. But in particular, they have to meditate on selflessness. And then there's, according to this, now we're getting into the object of negation thing. There's a gross level of selflessness and a subtle level of selflessness that actually this school teaches, and all the lower schools below this teach the same two levels of selflessness. So, and John, but just because you asked about it, we'll get into this more later, but in the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths, when it comes to the truth of suffering, there's the impermanent, the suffering, the empty, and the selfless. And you had asked, what's the difference between empty and selfless? This is the difference. Empty refers to empty of a permanent, unitary, independent self. And selfless refers to empty of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. So those are two different levels of selflessness that one meditates on. And I'll cover that again when we cover the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths in detail. But I wanted to mention it here because it's explained there. So what am I getting at? These words might seem confusing to people. So we'll start with this. And I remember I said earlier, we're going to look at these different objects of negation. And I want to say, just from a practice perspective, Lama Tsongkhapa in his Lamrim says, if you can't identify the object of negation in your own personal experience, you will not understand emptiness. It's impossible. You have to understand the object of negation. And Khentsur Eshe, I'm just going to go off on a slight tangent here. Khentsur Rinpoche told a beautiful story a number of times. I can't remember the name. It might have been Pabmo Drupa. It was a great Kagyu master who, he traveled. In those times there was no other way to travel. I guess with horses, but he walked. He walked all over Tibet, and he went to different masters. And he said he would go to the greatest masters of his time. He went to the great Sakya masters and the great masters of different schools, and he would say, "I heard about emptiness. What's it empty of?" And the master would answer, and he would go meditate on it. And then he'd come back and say, "I didn't get it yet. What's it empty of?" And And he would go all over Tibet asking these questions, and they would give correct answers, but he wasn't, not that worked for him, if that makes sense. So like he would go and he would say, ask another Lama, and they would say something, and he would meditate on that. And he would, it's empty of whatever, and he would go think about it. And he was not satisfied. He gained a lot of understanding, but he wasn't satisfied. And finally he met Gampopa, who was the greatest disciple of Milarepa, the most foremost disciple of Milarepa. And he said to Gampopa, what's it empty of? And I think Gampopa said something to him like, everything you've ever experienced. And somehow he was ready. And they said that he fell over, he fainted. He got so he realized what Gampopa had said, and he got so overwhelmed by the experience of what Gampopa had just told him that he basically collapsed and fell over on the floor. And when Gampopa kind of shook him and he sat up, he had realized emptiness. So Khenpo Rinpoche would tell that story, which is a story of a great Kagyu master, to make a point, which is you have to understand the object of negation, and that's how important it is. That's how even this guy walked all over Tibet asking everybody, what's the object of negation? What's the object of negation? We have to understand that if we want to have an experience of understanding what emptiness is. So in this school, this Svatantrika, Yogacara Svatantrika Pajamika, one of the most beautiful things about it is that it goes through all different objects of negation, from very gross to very subtle. So it starts with, we're starting now with so we're starting with the hearers, right, who are you could say like the lesser of those three vehicles, so so we could say the object of negation is going to be most gross, which is good. That's what we want to start with, right? And then they have from their perspective and their practice, they have to meditate on selflessness, which is the key point of the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths. And they start with what for them is a gross level of selflessness, which means, and what they're saying is things are empty that they are empty of having a permanent, unitary, independent self. So what is that? And in Buddhism and Buddhist philosophy, you say that's the grossest level. And what it's referring to is that is not an innate, it's not an innate thing. The next one's going to be innate. It's going to be something that we have from birth, that animals have. This one, animals don't have it and babies don't have it. It's an intellectually acquired kind of self that people grasp at, which is in ancient India, we would call it the Atman, right? And Buddhism, everybody knows, right? It says Anatman. Buddha said Anatman. There's no self, right? But this is grasping at Atman. But you could say, in English, might say, we say that your eternal soul, this is that, right? If somebody, and that nobody's born, like, dogs and babies don't have a view of an eternal soul, right? It's a learned concept that people have. So that's why it says here, permanent, right? Eternal. That's why I say my eternal soul, right? Oh, I don't want to damage my eternal soul. Something like that, right? So it's permanent, it's unitary, and it's independent, meaning, and where we say independent means it's independent of the body and mind, right? So there's some kind of, and people have these views, or a view like that. Many people have that view, right? That I have some kind of essence or self or soul that has nothing to do with my body and mind, that's permanent. So independent means not connect, right? Doesn't depend upon my body and my mind, and my body and mind don't depend on it. It's independent of them. It's singular, right? Unitary. It's one thing, right? The body and mind are a bunch of parts. You can see that, right? Your body's made up of all kinds of parts. Your mind's made up of all kinds of parts. Here, the idea is it's some kind of singular thing, right? That's permanent, that will last for all time, and it's an unchanging phenomenon. So that's the grossest level. And you can check, right? So now the point here is you can check in your own experience. Do I have a view of a permanent, unitary, independent self, right? And first of all, if you're Buddhist, you probably don't intellectually hold that position because Buddhists refute that position. But actually, if you grew up in a culture where that was part of your upbringing, then you may be able to find a part of you that has that view. If that makes, see what I'm getting at? So you have to check, do I have that view within me? Because I grew up, I learned that as a child. Whatever you learn as a child, you may still grasp that on some level. Yeah, so you check, do I have a view like that of a soul or a essence that's independent of the body and mind, that's permanent? And then you would meditate on, does that actually exist, or is it something that something that I grasp at that's actually a non-existent phenomenon? And if you realize it's a non-existent phenomenon, then you've realized the gross level of selflessness. That's the most gross of all the meditations on emptiness. That's also, from this school's perspective, the gross object main practice of hearers, Shravakas. Now I want to go to the subtle, right, which is the next one. And that one is called the view of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. And this view is the main, is from this school's perspective, is the cause of samsara, actually, and it's why hearers or Shravakas have to realize that it doesn't exist. Right? Is that it's the cause of their samsara? It's the cause of all being samsara. By the way, not just this school, but actually all Buddhist schools except Prasangika say this is the meaning of selflessness. So what is, actually, if you want to check in your own experience, what is the view of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self? And one point I want to make is this view, while you can intellectually acquire it, is the important part of it is innate. In other words, so this view we're born with due to past habituation, beginningless past habituation. This is an ignorance that non-humans grasp at, that babies grasp at, that adults grasp, that everybody who's all samsaric beings grasp at this level of self. And so it says self-sufficient and substantially existent. One way of getting at this, the meaning of that is that sometimes they say another way of translating in a way the idea is that it can stand on its own, right? Self-sufficient means something that can stand on its own, right? That's what self-sufficient means, isn't it? I mean, the words. And what's being gotten at here is in this view, we view this is how we innately view things. Actually, the Dalai Lama often points this out when he teaches that we feel that the I, the self, doesn't depend upon the body, or that it's not merely a dependent thing, but that it can stand on its own, independent of the body and mind. And when the Dalai Lama and the Buddhist masters teach on this, they often make points that they'll say things like, actually, it's funny, if you've ever felt jealous of somebody else's appearance or mind, like if you felt like, oh, I wish I had a mind like theirs, or I wish I looked like them. Or Dalai Lama sometimes says, as you get older, you might feel, oh, I wish I could trade in my body for that body. It's younger and stronger and healthier or something, right? So who's the I? Dalai Lama says, then he'll point out and say, who's the I that wishes there's an I that doesn't depend on your brain or mind, so you wish you had their mind? Who is that I that's independent of your mind, right? Or if you feel, oh, I wish I was young like that person, right? It's an innate feeling we can have, right? We can just feel that way spontaneously sometimes, like jealousy or something, right? Well, who's the I then? There's an I that's not dependent on your body that could have that body, and it's not dependent on your mind, but can have that mind. That's a self-sufficient, substantially existent. Other ways of getting at that kind of I are that often we say my body. Right? We say that all the time, or my mind. Oh, my mind is not so clear, right? So who's the I that owns the mind? Or my body's aging. My body's getting older. My body's tired. My body's, who's the I that's this? So it's implying there's an I that kind of relates to the body like the way you'd relate to a car or something, right? That can exist independent of it, and that exists independent of the mind also, right? If you say, my mind is dull today, well, who's the I, right? And we feel that way. And what this is getting at is just, we use our language to reflect how our experience, which is as if we have this self, right, an I, that is somehow that can stand on its own, independent of, that exists substantially, and that exists. And oftentimes we feel there are different ways, actually, Chandrakirti gets at this in his text, experientially. Sometimes we feel that, sometimes we may feel that that the body and mind dependent upon the eye. Sometimes we feel like they own the eye. Sometimes we feel like the eye is somehow like this thing that the body and mind exists within, or something like that. Sometimes we feel, and sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes we feel like I'm in my body, for example. Like you can feel I'm trapped in my body when I'm sick or something, right? As if there's an eye that's trapped in there, right? That's independent of the body. All of those are getting at this experience of a self-sufficient, substantially existent eye. And also, like, I'll get at another point with this, right? If it's actually also a feeling, is it? Like if you were about to be attacked, right? If somebody were like, if somebody were going to verbally attack you or physically attack you, right? You would get a feeling of, you would get some kind of feeling in your body, right? So, and that's based on an eye, right? Who is that eye, right? And you might say, well, they're going to attack my body, or they're going to attack my mind, right? If they're going to insult you, for example, or publicly humiliate you. And that feeling, that's very innate. You see, I'm getting, like, little kids have that as much as anybody, right? It's not something you acquire philosophically, but that's connected to this, it grows out of that fear, would grow out of this sense of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. And so one point I want to make is you have to identify that in your own experience if you're going to meditate on this kind of selflessness, right? That feeling, that experience of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. Next thing I want to say, and this is the part that's interesting, is like, if you could identify that, right, which is good, and then you have to meditate on that it doesn't exist, and there are all different reasonings then that are used, right? Like, and if you've studied emptiness a bit, you've studied them, right? Like, is it one with the body? If it exists, it has to be one with the body or different from the body. So you check, is it one with the body and mind, one with the aggregates, or different than the aggregates? Sorry. And then you check, does it exist? Does it truly exist as one with the aggregates, or does it truly exist as other than the aggregates? And then there are other reasons, which we can go through. But one point I want to make is that's it. And actually, if you can do that, right, if you can identify that self-sufficient, substantially existent self in your own experience, and then recognize, well, it can't be, if it were one with the aggregates, I'd have to be able to find it on the aggregates, right? But first of all, the aggregates are many, and that self is one, right? And also, the aggregates change every instant. Where is the self in that? You can keep going, right? Also, you could check, right? If you check the different parts of the body, none of them correlate to that. If you check the different parts of the other aggregates, the aggregates that are non-physical, you don't find it. But so then it would have to exist inherent, intrinsically separate from the body and mind. But you never find it anywhere other than where the body and mind are experientially. So how can it exist independent of them and separate from them? Intrinsically separate. If we're intrinsically separate, we have no something that two things that are intrinsically separate, you find them in different places, right? Like a horse and an elephant. You find an elephant over here and a horse over there, but you never find a self somewhere far away, independent of the body and mind. Anyway, there are many different reasonings you would use, and eventually you would realize that self-sufficient, substantially existent self, you would grasp at it since beginningless time and since you were born, but it doesn't exist at all. And here's the freaky part, right? In a way, to me, is that's a very profound realization, right, of selflessness, and that's not the Madhyamaka object of negation, right? That according to they're saying here, that's the object of negation meditated on for years, right? So that's very profound. But if many of us would think, oh, then I've realized emptiness. What Nagarjuna meant. Do you see why you have to study this now? I'm hoping it's like to identify that object in your own experience is challenging. To meditate on its emptiness and to realize its emptiness is an amazing achievement meditatively and in terms of practice. But if you study this school, I hope you're starting to see why studying this school is very valuable, right? That would be an amazing realization And then you go, oh, I'm many, but that's only the main object of abandonment of the subtle object of abandonment of hearers, right? Uh-oh, what's the, keep going, so that's still not subtle enough, uh, according to this school, right? And if you can't understand the objects of negation in this school, you won't understand the one of the consequentialist school. So okay, then what's the object? Then that was the lower, right? That was the hearers. Then the next vehicle up, you could say, in terms of merit, is the Pratyeka Buddhas, the solitary realizers. And their object, their main object of abandonment comes from the Yogacara, or the mind-only school. So their main object of abandonment, which is more subtle now. And by the way, I should say this too. In this school, there's in the two Hinayana schools of Buddhist philosophy, there's just selflessness of persons. There's no they don't meditate on selflessness of objects, of things other than persons. Mahayana schools all meditate on both. Meditate on the emptiness, the selflessness of persons, and the selflessness of phenomena, we call it. So now we're going to get into the selflessness of phenomena. So a Pratyeka Buddha, their main object of abandonment, and I'll actually read the term the way they translate it here, is the conception that objects and their respective object possessors, or the consciousness is perceiving them, are of different substantial entities. So that's actually that, by the way, that is what's taught in the mind-only school, right? So it means that, if you want to put it simply, it means external objects don't exist. But that's actually kind of not a subtle way to put it. So, but more accurate way to put it here is that that we view, right? So now you have to check your own experience, right? In terms, I'm going back to the object of negation thing. And actually, okay, so there's an easy way to do it. I'm just going to get it experientially. We all live somewhere, right? So imagine for a moment that you're standing there looking at the place where you were outside, looking at the place where you live, and you see somebody with a sledgehammer come up and start wailing on your place. There will be a very clear experience of feeling, that's my place. Get away from it. Leave it alone. Stop doing that, right? There's an experience of that things exist out there independent of the mind, right? And according to the object of negation here is this view that that things exist separate and cut off from the mind's perceiving them. That there's actually another way of saying it is dualism, right? Subject-object dualism. That's another way of putting it, right? So that and the way they put it here, right? That objects and they call it, this is a technical term in Buddhist philosophy, objects and object possessors. Object possessor means a consciousness that's perceiving an object. So it's getting at dualism, right? That objects and the consciousness perceiving them are of different substantial entities, right? Or separate and cut off, or exist as different substantial entities. And this school's position is that, well, they both arise due to a single karmic seed. So, and they arise simultaneously and they cease simultaneously. So that view that they exist separately and independently as separate substantial entities is ignorance, right? Is a kind of ignorance, and that we have to realize that things, that minds and objects perceiving minds don't exist as separate substantial entities. That things don't exist dualistically. Is another way of putting it. That's subtler, by the way, than what we called, or I mentioned earlier, this self-sufficient, substantially existent self. This is a subtler object of meditation. And what this school says is that solitary realizers, they do meditate on the gross level of self-grasping. I mentioned, like the permanent, independent, unitary self. They do meditate on the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. But their main practice is to meditate on this, on that, on the lack, the emptiness, lack of dualism, or that there are no external objects, or that external objects in the mind's perceiving them don't exist as separate substantial entities. That's the more accurate way to say it. Now I want to ask, so pause for a minute. Can you tell in your own experience, that object of negation, right? That object, and how you perceive yourself and other, right, as existing as separate substantial entities. Your consciousness and what it perceives, objects, all kinds of objects, meaning physical objects or mental objects or other beings, and then those include other beings too, right? And according to so going to this school, that's an object of negation. And by the way, right, that's the main object of negation, the main object of abandonment, rather, for solitary realizers. But do you see, bodhisattvas have to meditate on all these, right? So now you've got 3 different meditations, right? With 3 different, they're all empty, right? But they're all empty of different levels of subtlety of object. Does that make sense? Now, according to this school, that's not yet the subtlest. Does that make sense? So now we're going to get what's the subtlest one in this school's position. So the subtlest one from this school's position is the lack of true existence. And that's the Madhyamaka. By the way, this one's Madhyamaka now. I want to pause and ask you a question just to think about. So we're about to get into what's the Madhyamaka position now of this school, right? How is the lack of a self, I would ask you, just to think about it for a second. Do you understand in your own self, how is the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self that remember the subtle one I mentioned earlier? The self-sufficient, substantially existent self. The selflessness of that, right? Which is the subtle object of negation for hearers. I want to ask you, are you clear on how that's not the object of negation? Why isn't that Madhyamaka? Why is that object of negation not subtle enough? How is that, how is that not subtle? And my point is, if you're not sure, right, that's okay. It's fine. It's not a problem. But then you don't understand the Prasangi, you don't understand the Madhyamaka school, right? And that's great. That's not a criticism. If you go I don't understand the difference. Good. That's progress, right? Now you're going, oh, wow. I thought I understood. If you ever thought you understood something, then you go, okay, there's a difference of subtlety I'm not seeing yet. That's awesome. That's wow, I've got to study that. I've got to. And now do you see why that guy walked all over Tibet? You see, going back, why did he walk everywhere and ask people? You see, it's not a criticism of us. If it's not clear to you, he was a great master. He was a monk, a Tibetan monk who spent his life walking around asking questions about Buddhism. He couldn't experientially differentiate them until he met Gampopa, right? So, and why did Tsongkhapa? If you read the biography of Tsongkhapa, right? He was talking to Manjushri in visions, and he was meeting with the greatest. Tsongkhapa met with the greatest masters of his time of Buddhism. He became at a certain point, he was already one of the greatest living philosophers. He had spent years in retreat, and he had visions of Manjushri, right? And he would talk to Manjushri in his visions. That's how advanced he was in his practice. And he would say to Manjushri, I think how I understand emptiness. And Manjushri would say, you don't understand anything yet. You haven't yet understood the object of negation. So if you don't understand that, it's not oh, it's something wrong with me. Good. That's, and the practice is going, part of the practice, not the whole practice, but part of the practice is going, what is the difference between those things? And then you'll think you get it, and then you have to go again. What is it? And experientially, it's not just intellectually, but experientially. You give rise to an experience of self-grasping. You notice it in your experience. You don't have to give rise to it. It's always there, but you have to kind of notice it. So you do different philosophical, it's not just philosophical exercises. Khensa Rinpoche told me once when he was studying emptiness he was with Trijang Rinpoche in Tibet. They would have a few monks hold the monk, and they would on the cliffs of Tibet, right? Great highest mountains on the planet. And they would act like they were going to push you off the cliff, but hold on to you. And a feeling would arise. Now you sit down and meditate. Okay, what kind of self-grasping, which object of negation is that? You check. Oh, I just felt like I was going to fall off a cliff. This feeling arose in me. Is that the gross? Is that the subtle? What's going on in me? And then you would meditate on emptiness of that. So you see what I'm getting at here? This is not just an intellectual exercise. That's why I'm telling this story, right? Tsongkhapa, who spent years and years in retreat, and going around asking visionary questions and personal questions, or a guy with Gampopa, or Khenpo Rinpoche's story about like getting shoved off a cliff in the Himalayas. Like, they spend years, right, meditating on in their own experience on, can I find the object of negation? Then can I meditate on its emptiness, right? And then I understand its emptiness. Then you go back and you say, which object of negation was that? And even His Holiness Dalai Lama, he often tells that story, right, where he went to his teacher, Ling Rinpoche, and he says he had some experience of emptiness, right? And he went to his teacher, and he said, I had this experience. He describes it, right, like, this amazing experience of where he was contemplating, meditating on emptiness. He had this experience, and he was a young monk. Well, he was a young person. He was always, but he went to Ling Rinpoche and said, "What was that?" And Ling Rinpoche said, "Soon you'll be a sky yogi." Right? He means he hadn't yet realized. He was saying, so even to the Dalai Lama, right? Ling Rinpoche, his main guru, said, "Well, that's not quite it, but soon you'll be a sky yogi. Soon you'll realize." Meaning, when he says soon you'll be a sky yogi, it means you're getting close. Soon you'll realize the view, right? That's the Dalai Lama. So, do you get why this is important? I'm trying to just emphasize why one would study this, right? It's like, well, can I tell the difference between these things? If you just say, oh, I'm, whatever, you give rise to some very obvious kind of experience of self-grasping, and then you meditate. That's good. It's a good thing to do. But then you have to understand, what object of negation was that? And is it subtle? At what level of subtlety am I at? And how do I progress? How do I keep progressing? And if you're not curious about that, that's okay, but then you won't realize emptiness. That's the problem. So then, okay, the most subtle one, according to this school, is what they call, they say, I'll read you the quote: the bodhisattvas take as their main object of abandonment the conception of true existence. And so according to this school, true existence, and I want to say, this school's view is that for an object to be said to exist, whether it's a person or an external object, doesn't matter. It's same thing. What's required is dependent origination, right? In other words, things exist dependently. And what does that mean from the school's perspective? And what that means is there has to be something. There has to be what they call. I'm going to read the actual term and then I'll explain. That the Svatantrika Madhyamikas assert that the conventional mode of existence of an object is posited by dependence upon two factors: the objective mode of subsistence of the subject, and the appearance of this to a non-defective awareness. So what that means is that for something to exist, there has to be the objective mode of subsistence of the object, right? So there has to be an object of perception, right, that is there, and then it has to be perceived by a mind, by an awareness. And based on those two factors, you say that exists. And then what they would say is, if someone posits an object existing merely through the force of an awareness without depending upon the object's uncommon mode of subsistence, by the way, which is what the Prasagikas assert, then they would say that's nihilism. I want to make sure we get what we're saying. So, like, I'm going to give a simple example for a second, because I think it's can become difficult to understand. What they're saying is this: for objects to exist, they have to be an object of perception. They have to be perceived. Otherwise, you can't say it exists. But there also has to be the object that's perceived, and that's dependent origination, right? So I'm going to give an example of fire, right? There has to be, you can't, like, in other words, if I say, oh, here's a fire, well, you would say that it's ridiculous. You made up a word, but there's no fire there, right? So there has to be like a base, right? A basis of perception, which is some burning thing. And there has to be a consciousness perceiving that. And it depends upon those two factors, you can say that exists conventionally. But and then true existence, right, would mean that things exist independent of a perceiver. And this school says things don't exist independent of a perceiver, right? Everything that exists, if it's existing, there's a mind perceiving it. It has to be either a either a what's the word? A direct perceiver or a conceptual mind. And either can have valid concept. So that's why it said valid. They have to appear to a valid, non-defective awareness, right? So things existing depend upon, and this is, I want to go back to that term that they used here. There's a term here that it has to depend upon the object's uncommon mode of subsistence, right? So you can't, and what they're getting at there is, you can't call ice fire, right? Uncommon mode of existence. Like in other words, a fire is something from this school's perspective that is hot and burns, right? And you can't say if you look at a piece of ice, at a block of ice, you can't say that's fire just because you say it, right? Otherwise, there's no valid conventional functioning of things. So they say things have to have their own uncommon mode of subsistence, meaning, fire exists one way and ice exists a different way. And then there has to be a perceiver perceiving it. And through that interdependent experience of a mind perceiving and a thing existing with its own uncommon mode of subsistence, things exist conventionally. Ultimately, they're empty of existing independent of those two factors. Right? So true existence would be that things exist in a way that doesn't depend upon those two factors. So now, what's the object of negation here? Do you see how it's subtler than a self-sufficient substantially existent self? Here it's not saying self-sufficient substantially existent self was saying that there's a self that exists, right, that doesn't depend upon the aggregates. Here what we're saying, and you could, by the way, here what you're meditating on the emptiness of is phenomena, right? But that phenomena could be, a chair, or it could be yourself as a person, right? You're also a phenomenon. So the idea is that true existence is existing independent of a base, right? A valid base, and a mind perceiving that base. That's a different object of negation, isn't it? Now, do you see, by the way, I'll just make a comment. I think, you could see if I don't know which philosopher, Gampoa was speaking from this perspective or Prasangika perspective at that moment when he said that, but when he said to his student, right, when the guy said, what's the object of negation? He said, everything you've ever perceived. What you could say from this school's perspective, what he was saying was, in every moment since before you were born, you've been perceiving things as if they exist truly, independent of a base, a valid subsistence, a valid, uncommon mode of subsistence of the object, and a mind perceiving it, which is probably true, actually, isn't it? We perceive things that way. Do you see how this is a subtler object of negation, or do you start to see that? It's not easy to understand it, right? Shouldn't be easy. That's not supposed to be, but that's what the object of negation is here, right? So the object of negation is true, is that things exist through true existence, which means, again, independent, that they exist independently. But in this sense, independent doesn't mean independent of the five aggregates. It means independent of having its own uncommon mode of subsistence on the side of the object of perception, and then having a consciousness perceiving it in that moment. And if both of those exist, then the object exists conventionally, but it lacks any true existence, meaning independent of those two factors. And that's the main practice of the bodhisattvas in this school. And if they overcome that, then that's the main path to Buddhahood. And now I'll just say one last point. This is not about this school, and that object of negation is not nearly as subtle as the object of negation of the consequentialist Prasangika school. So you have to, and the reason why I say that is now you can go, oh wow, like if I don't study this, how in the world would I understand? So then if you just study Chandrakirti, if you start with Chandrakirti and he says, the object of negation is things existing inherently. How is that different than this? And that if you don't have a clear experiential understanding of that, especially in regards to your own self, then you can't understand experientially. You can't realize Chandrakirti's position. So now, do you see the value? Like when I look at for me personally, when I look at that, I go, wow, that this school gets at all these different, because it presents it in this way, right? That the hearers have these two, this kind of object negation. The Prajeka Buddhas have this one. The Bodhisattvas have that one. And if you contemplate that in terms of your own experience of grasping, then you can start to go, wow, that really helps you to eventually be able to meditate on emptiness in this school's position or in the Prasangika, either one. And if you don't meditate on this school's, how are you going to understand that school's? I don't know. It'd be quite difficult. Or Robin has her hand up.
Sorry, I don't want to keep you from keep going and telling us more about Prasangika, but so this object of negation of true existence, is this also Svatantika or is it just Yogacara? It is.
Oh, yeah, this is the common to all the Svatantika. So like the difference for the Yogacaras is that with the for example, in the Yogacara, they present the one I mentioned with the Prajeka Buddhas, that the object and object possessor, mind and objects are separate entities. That the Svatantrika Svatantrika Madhyamikas don't teach that. But this one, this position, the true existence description, that's common. So in other words, the other sub branch of the Svatantrika are the Svatantrika Madhyamikas. So, which just means that they explain conventionalities in a way similar to Svatantrika philosophers. That's all that really means. But all the Svatantrika Madhyamikas give this definition of true existence.
Thank you.
So that's common to like Baba Viveka, and to Kamalashila, to all of them. So it doesn't matter. Yeah. So this is common to all of those. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you.
And then Ryan has a hand up too.
I just want to see, I want to see if I can put this into words, but also see like if I'm maybe on the right path here. Like when we were talking about the hearer's object of negation, my mind went to like almost like that evolutionary survivalist instinct, right? You're threatened and your instincts instantly go to survival of your personal idea of self, right? And negating negating almost that instinctual separateness that you feel there. Where when we talked about the Mahayana object, my mind went to that old riddle, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? And it sounds like the answer here under the Yogacaras Satantrika Madhyamikas would be no, it doesn't. If no one's around, if there's no perceiver, object possessor around to perceive the object, then no, it doesn't make a sound. And that is not that is to me that is more subtle, much more subtle than the survivalist instinct of the other level. And I don't know if I'm making any sense at all, but that is what I thought of and wrote down.
I think it's interesting, first of all, and I'll say a couple of thoughts. One is, I think that about the first point about the one that's for Prajeka Buddhas. I mean, I give an example. I think that I think that that dualistic instinct connected to survival would be included within that. But at one point I'll just make is do remember that from this school's perspective, that sense of dualism, though, of course, this is also there when we're feeling desire, and is also there even if you're just let's say you're feeling safe and you're just walking around DC, but you feel like the buildings exist separately from your consciousness perceiving them. So it's there in all those ways, so it would be included. So the example you gave, yes, it would be included within that. But, if you're feeling totally safe one day and at ease and you're walking through the Smithsonian, but you're perceiving the building as separate the building, you perceive it as though the building and the conscious perceiving it exist as separate entities, that still would be the object of negation in that position at one point. So I'm just saying, yes, you're right, but it would also expand it. But then,
yeah, that's
sorry.
Go ahead. I was gonna say, I can see how it's important to understand it, because it'd be, if you don't really understand it, it'd be easy to hear that, believe it, and fall into like solipsism.
Yeah.
Oh, it doesn't exist if I'm not there, it's not there. Right. You can see how that could like be a hurdle.
Yep. And then to your second point about the tree falling in the forest, which I've thought about in this context sometimes too. A couple of points just to contemplate. Like, one is like, if like, well, I don't know. I mean, if the monks were out debating in the courtyard, right, like about using this school's definition of true existence, and ask that, they don't ask that question. I don't think about tree falling in the forest in our culture, but if they could, and my, I don't know where they would end up, but they would I imagine at least that they would have all different points that one might make if you were debating. One is, they might say, well, did a Buddha's omniscient mind perceive the sound?
Yeah.
And then does it exist or not? And does a Buddha's omniscient mind perceive a sound that nobody else perceives or not? And whatever but there's another question, which is that is, I think, more interesting actually than that, which is, well, like, there are two kinds of valid minds. There are direct perceivers and there are conceptual, like inferential cognizers, called conceptual minds. And so it's an interesting question I would raise. I think they would raise a question, like, if you see a fallen tree, right? Let's say you're walking through the woods after the windstorm, and you see the fallen tree, and then you were to, what's the word? If you were to say, well, no ear consciousness, if you were to present first animals might have heard it, but if you were to posit an idea that no ear consciousness perceived that, but then if you were to say, well, logically, and my inferential cognizer says when trees fall, by definition, sound waves are produced. Would that, so they would raise a question: is that an inferential cognizer perceiving that sound existed? And then does the sound exist because an inferential cognizer through a correct reason asserted that it exists? And they would just get in, and I'm not trying to say did the sound exist or not, but what's interesting there is they're getting at this question of what is the non-defective awareness? What's the nature of the non-defective awareness that can be what's the word? That can be a perceiver of a phenomena, so that then through dependent origination, that phenomena conventionally exists. And that would be the question, at least, if that makes sense. So that's just how I think it's how you would, from this school's perspective, explore that question, at least.
I just think this is fascinating, and I loved when we talked about it during tenets, and I'm glad we're talking about it again, because it's really, really complicated.
It is, And then Frank has hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren, for the great teachings. My comment is that the different levels of objects of negation. It almost seems that, like, what comes first is the identification of the object of negation, or it seems like one needs to engage in a fair amount of meditation and analysis of emptiness, of selflessness, of dependent originations, in order to even to then see the true object of negation. So it's like little chicken or egg. I don't know if you had any comments about that.
I completely agree with you. And I think I think what you're getting at is, whether in those examples I gave, whether it's I think it might have been Padmadrupa, but that Kagyu master, or if you think of Tsongkhapa, who spent years and years in meditation, and questioning, and, in other words, I think their biographies are getting it, or implying what you're saying, which is that, it's like you meditate, and even like the Dalai Lama's example, right, where he said that thing to Ling Rinpoche, and Rinpoche said, soon, the point being, like, that one has to kind of, I think that is the process, isn't it? Is like, and then sometimes it's, and the Dalai Lama said that, I think, at one of those, where he asked, like, is it, something happened to my screen, where the Dalai Lama, and even Tsongkhapa in some of his, sometimes they'll say, like, what is the let's say it right. You know, like Tsongkhapa in one of his visions said to Manjushri, I had this experience in meditation, which school's view was it according to? Does that make sense? Oh, something's happening with the screen game. I don't know, but anyways, back. But does that make sense? That like, so in other words, Tsongkhapa would say, oh, I had this experience. Which school was it according to? Which school did it accord to, or something? It's getting at your point, which is you meditate on the emptiness, and then you have to go back and you check, right? Ultimately, it's your own checking, right? Okay, I refuted something. I had an experience. What was that? You know, which object negation did I actually experientially refute?
Yeah.
And then you keep looking for that more subtle and subtle. Yeah.
Thanks.
And then somebody else had their hand up too. Oh, Wilhelmina. Yeah. Oh, your sound's not on. You have to turn off the mute. Yeah, you have to turn off the mute button.
You gotta hit the audio button, and that'll get rid of your mute. Should be bottom left.
Okay.
Good. Oh, you muted again. You unmuted and then you muted again.
Audio.
Oh, yeah, well, good.
I'm thinking about when I was young, very young, and we as kids went to the beach. Lots of kids. And I have a sister who wants to go swimming most of the time. I liked to jump from a high quay into the sand. And I kept on doing that over and over and over again. And it was just the feeling of nothingness that was very sad. And when you were talking about this, and I get it also when I do certain meditations, it's the same kind of feeling. And I don't know what you can make of this.
Oh, so it sounds like you're saying it was like some kind of, maybe a karmic tendency from a previous life, maybe.
It's because it comes back and back again in my thoughts. That it's the same kind of feeling. So I'm not crazy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's interesting.
Thank you.
Wow. That's interesting, yeah. Maybe one of the challenges of if you have unusual karma for your context, cultural context. I think many people have that, where you have, if you have that a certain karmic tendency that doesn't fit easily with the culture you're in, but would fit in a different culture, it could have its own gifts and challenges both.
Yeah.
Oh, and then John?
Yeah, thank you. Something that helps me is that, doing a meditation on the object of negation, whether it's from the Shravaka or the particular Buddha or in the Mahayana, is to not so much think about that object not existing, negating its possibility of existing, but rather to think about how it exists and what flaw, in my current understanding is contributing to that appearance the way it is. Because otherwise, if I just tend toward negating it outright and not taking it further, into investigating, why my particular karma is projecting that appearance, then I think it tends toward that extreme wrong view of nihilism, which of course is just throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? And I think for me, what it all gets to, and this is why I found the study of the Uttara Tantra so just unbelievably satisfying and beneficial, is that it gets toward that perception of a primordial unity of appearance and emptiness. And again, I think this is what Gyaltsab Je, and Tsongkhapa described as the very most difficult of all of Buddha's teachings to comprehend, how things can both appear and be empty of any kind of independent, nature to appear, how that can be. And apparently we have to, first of all, come to a conceptual understanding of that, and then move toward seeing it directly, and then finally have to get beyond the 10th bhumi before we actually can do it, that simultaneous perception. But yeah, it is, I agree, it's just so very beneficial to look at these different subtleties, and try to understand what in our present understanding, where each of us is with regard to how we perceive and understand both ourselves and objects in the world, and really try to understand that clearly, and then try to understand what teachers like Tsongkhapa and so on are getting at. So thank you. Just a lot of meat in this discussion, right?
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Well, and one quick comment about that too made me remember a point which is worth thinking about sharing just briefly. And then I'll stop in a minute. But I remember, it's in the teachings, but I remember when Yume Kensho Rinpoche was teaching on the easy path. He made a point, which was, when you're meditating, getting what you were saying about, he actually said, you have to first identify the object of negation in your own experience. And then he was saying that then you have to have a part of your mind hold on to it actually, and you understand, as you're saying, how you're perceiving it, but you keep that mind there. So there's like a mind, they call it self-grasping. So there's like the mind grasping at a self. And he was saying you keep that mind present actually, and you stay aware of it. And you have to be able to, in your meditation, actually hold that awareness of the mind, of a subjective mind grasping at a, say in this case, self-sufficient substantiation self, or a truly existent self. And he was saying, and then only after you can hold it, then you apply with a corner of your mind, so to speak, you apply a reasoning, a Majjhimaka, for example, reasoning. And then he made an interesting point. He said, there comes a point when you actually, if you're really experiencing it, where you're in meditation, you have a mind and a grasping at a self, the mind grasping at a self, and you apply this reasoning. And then he says, there comes a point when you realize that the object of that grasping doesn't exist, that the mind grasping at it and the object grasped at disappear in your own experience, because you're holding, it's like one part of your mind is actually watching or aware of another part of your mind grasping at a self. And then when you disprove the existence of that self, the self which never existed and the mind grasping at it, which did exist but was a mind of ignorance, he said both disappear, dissolve. And what's left then is only the wisdom mind that understands that they don't exist. That's all that's left in that moment. And he was saying that's how the experience goes in practice.
It sounds like you're describing the Prajnaparamita then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, sorry, Robin, go ahead.
This is going off on a slightly different tangent, so I didn't want to interrupt what you were about to say.
Oh, no, go ahead.
The thing that I was hoping that we would get a single sentence or a quick definition of a prasangika view of emptiness before we part company today?
Oh, sure, I can do it. One way of getting at it, and actually, if you look at it from this school's perspective for a second, I'm sorry, if I'm not from this school's perspective, but if I start with this school, right? Remember I said that there has to be, I'm actually going to read a quote. Where is it? Oh, there it is. Oops. Oh, there it is. So in this school that we were just studying's perspective, right? I'll just read a quote about Yogacara Svatantrika. It says, the existence of an object by way of its own uncommon mode of subsistence with, oh no, that's not it. Basically what it's, yeah, that is it. Okay, so that emptiness means the existence of an object by way of its own, I'm sorry, true existence is this. The existence of an object by way of its own uncommon mode of subsistence without being posited through the force of appearing to a non-defective awareness. Right, so here's what I was getting at earlier, right? That things have their own uncommon mode of subsistence, and then they appear to a non-defective awareness, and that's how they exist conventionally in this school's perspective. One way of getting it, in the Prasangika school, we say things lack intrinsic existence or inherent existence. Actually, this school says that too, but they mean something different. But this is, now you can get clear. What it means, where it said, the object, here we're saying there's objects have some kind, an object of perception has some kind of uncommon mode of subsistence, right? Fire is hot, ice is cold, whatever, and then there has to be a mind perceiving it, right? And that's how it exists. The Prasangika school says things that the uncommon mode of subsistence is the object of negation. Or as they say, that this school says things have some existence from their own side, that then also that's what they contribute to the dependent origination, and then there has to be the mind perceiving them. Prasangika say, as soon as you assert that things have some existence from their own side, or that things have some kind of uncommon mode of subsistence, that's the object of negation, actually. And so if you understand this school, it actually helps you understand the Prasangikas, because there are all these debates, which I actually think like Bhava Viveka and Chandrakirti, and there are these debates in Buddhist texts about this. But it's actually helping us understand the Prasangika view then, right? Because Bhava Viveka, you can see how he's quite reasonably saying, well, if you don't say that fire is hot, it is actually hot, and that ice is actually cold, then you're being nihilistic. Chandrakirti saying, if you say fire is hot from its own side, you're asserting inherent existence, which is the object of negation, and things don't exist that way, and then there are all these absurd consequences if you assert that, right? And I was thinking of that the other day, and I was thinking, oh yeah, like I would say, oh, a fire in a fireplace is hot, right? But actually, if you're studying the origins of the universe, the scientists will say, then things cooled to this level, right? They got much cooler. And that cooler level is hotter than the fire in the fireplace. So then you say, well, no, that's cool, right? That's not hot, that's cold compared to the fire at the beginning of the universe. So it only exists. So then, Chandrakirti's point is things only exist, they merely exist through interdependent factors. There is no intrinsic existence from its own. If you say it's hot from its own side, then you have to say, well, it's hotter. It's hot even when you're saying it's cool compared to the fire at the beginning of the universe. That's ridiculous. So I'm getting at the absurd consequences. Yeah.
The relativity of it. The thing that I was going to ask you, and it's probably too late now, but trying to think about our own Buddha nature from this most subtle view. Because I think that even when we think about Buddha nature, we're assigning some inherence to this, and to try and really parse out the subtle dependence, this mental continuum.
Yeah, one quick comment I'll make on that is, like, if you think of it from, like, say that I actually think you're right, and I think, like, if you look at it from, so like the mind-only school teaches Buddha nature, right? But actually you can get it that way, right? Because the mind-only school teaches Buddha nature, but they say the mind is truly existent. So from their perspective, Buddha nature is truly existent too. Then, it's empty of existing separate, it's empty in other ways, but it's not empty of true existence. Then from this school's perspective, right, the Yogacara Svatantrika Majjhimaka, they would say Buddha nature is not truly existent, but it is inherently, it exists. It has to have its own, they would say inherently existent. They would say it has to exist by its own uncommon mode of subsistence, right? So they're still asserting that it has something from its own side. When you say somebody meditated on their Buddha nature, the Buddha nature exists, but it has to have its own uncommon mode of subsistence, and then it exists and depends upon the mind perceiving it. Only then the prasangika. So you can think, if you think of from those three perspectives, right? Mind only, yoga, tantrika, majjhimaka in general. Then you get to the prasangikas who say it has no, it's like there's nothing existing from its own side at all in the Buddha nature. So you see the difference then.
Then you really, really have to depend on dependent origination. That's your only source of coming to understand.
And of existence, right? Things only exist through mere dependent origination.
And thinking about the lack of inherent existence of your aggregates, which are almost completely mental and consciousness. It's like, wow, this is very, very subtle.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lauren. This is such a great clarification. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much.
I know we should stop now. I'll just say a couple quick comments and then we'll start and then I'll do the dedication. Just to finish up, we'll finish now. So it's one is, so next class we'll cover the 16 aspects. We'll start covering the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths. So we'll go into that. We're going to, of course, do them from now. Now you know a little bit more the Yogacara Svatantrika Majjhimaka perspective. So we're going to do it from that perspective, of course, because that's what this text comes from. But we're going to look at the 16 aspects. And one last point, just to be clear about it, just in terms of this Svatantrika Majjhimaka Yogacara, is also just Svatantrikas in general, Majjhimakas. Just remember also that in terms of objects of abandonment, also that they teach that there are objects of abandonment that are mental afflictions that are obstacles to liberation. And then they also teach objects of abandonment which are obstacles to omniscience of a Buddha. And according to this school, actually this school is unique, that they say this school is unique in saying there are gross and subtle obstacles to omniscience. The gross obstacles to omniscience are dualism, seeing subjects and objects as different substantial entities. And from their perspective, this school's perspective, the seeds or the seeds of the concept of true existence are the subtle objects of abandonment for omniscience, to omniscience. So this school teaches that way, and they view that the obstacles to omniscience begin to be abandoned at the first bhumi. Prasangika say at the 8th bhumi. You're not able to get rid of the obstacles to omniscience till you start doing that till you get to the 8th bhumi. So those are just a couple more unique differences between those tenet systems. But anyway, that's an overview of the Yogacara Svatantrika Majjhimaka school. And next time we'll look at we'll start looking at the 16 aspects of the Four Noble Truths, which are taught by all Buddhist schools, but we'll look at them from the perspective of this text. Thanks. And okay, we'll do the dedication. The supreme jewel, bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. I dedicate all these merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side. Say the I, who is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, may achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, in order to lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, to the state of enlightenment as quickly as possible. And through this effort, studying these tenets, may we all be able to realize what the object of negation is, and then realize its emptiness of its emptiness, and that way, achieve the greatest possible benefit for ourselves and all other sentient beings. Well, thanks, everybody. I forget, we're already scheduled for the next class, so good.